Welcome to another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things mutual aid. This show is part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, a worker-owned media collective founded by activists, analysts, and media workers to build internationalist dialogue from below and to connect struggles from across the globe. If you like the work that we do and want to support us, please head over to www.patreon.com/fromtheperiphery, where for as little as $5 a month, you become a member of a growing community of conscientious people from around the world. Get early access to all our projects, exclusive content, and an invitation to our monthly virtual hangouts. Because we are an independently funded collective, your support empowers us to continue our work of challenging corporate media and the mainstream narratives by elevating the voices, struggles, and ideas that are otherwise dismissed and silenced. In this episode, I'm joined by Angustia Celeste. We talk about the politics of borders, relationships, and mutual aid. I'd like to offer a trigger warning for the last 20 minutes where we discuss addiction, loss, and harm reduction. Without further ado, here's another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast. This is your host, Israa, and today I'm joined with Angustia Celeste, an activist, a scholar, and a radical writer. Angustia, would you like to introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I appreciate the opportunity to chat. I guess I am all the things you listed. I believe we connected because I've been doing mutual aid and humanitarian aid for about 18 years. I'm based in North America. Much of my border work has been on the US-Mexico border in Arizona and northern Sonora. And I've also participated in no border movements in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe. And I have been doing other kinds of mutual aid for a long time as well. So I work as a healthcare worker currently, but I do spend a lot of time focusing on things like harm reduction and providing community care in the context of unhoused communities. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious, just want to start off and jump into what mutual aid means to you within your work and how is it reflected in your politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I was reflecting on this and listening to the previous interviews that you've already done with this project, I can't say I don't love theory because I absolutely do, but I definitely came into mutual aid by way of humanitarian aid. And I definitely can contextualize for you the history of the humanitarian aid work I've done within movement work. And that kind of came out of the sanctuary movement in the 80s that was helping folks who were moving from the southern US-Mexico border up through the States to Canada to be able to successfully apply for asylum. Because at the time, the US was complicit in the conflicts in Central and South America that were causing people to need to flee their homes, much like today. US policy hasn't changed that much in the last 50 years. So, I could definitely contextualize for you the history of the border work that I started doing in 2007. I joined a collective that had begun in 2004. But it's interesting that I haven't spent a lot of time kind of reflecting on the origins of mutual aid or its exact definition. And I think this is probably pretty common. I think people are drawn to the work itself because it's concrete, pragmatic, the community, and the needs that you see in an immediate sense. And taking a step back to really think strategically about hopefully it's something that you find the time to do, but there is something about the crisis cycle that doesn't always allow that reflection. So resource redistribution and community care, which I think has been discussed pretty extensively already on your podcast. I think for me personally, it's a way of finding balance in my life between the world as it exists and the world that I want to exist. And it's, I've always been a systems kind of meta thinker. And it's been helpful for me to ground myself in practical work that I can find meaning and value in. So I think, aside from the humanitarian aid work I've done a lot of other movement work. I've done prisoner support. I've supported encampments. I've supported wider kind of infrastructural flashpoints historically, things like Standing Rock. And those are all experiences that have kind of like moving targets for your goals and your strategies and involve collaboration across a lot of different groups. And I think for me, the thing that really appeals to me about humanitarian aid, mutual aid on the border is that it's very concrete and it happens right in front of you. So it's about the relationship you're developing in that moment, and all of the reasons that you meet that person in that place could be discussed and analyzed, but really you're just providing resources, a space to pause, respite, and information. You know, I think I think the ideological origins of mutual aid for me really come from, my generation was influenced pretty heavily by the Zapatistas, and this idea of being in common struggle with someone. I know that solidarity, not charity, adium has been discussed extensively as well here. And I think, it's easy to say that, but then you got to think, well, what's my investment in this? Could I walk away from this work tomorrow? What are the things that I'm getting out of this mutual exchange, if it is indeed a mutual exchange? So I think for me, really trying to figure out how much I have in any particular exchange or struggle, what I'm willing to give, what I'm willing to give up, and what I'm willing to risk is kind of an essential part of what makes something mutual aid as opposed to just charity or resource redistribution, both of which I should say do have their place in a world where survival is increasingly more challenging.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating you bringing this up right now. It's something I've also been thinking about. And I think within the context of the border, we see these three elements play out in a very interesting way. Following reading like your Zine, the Insurgent Southwest, I sat there thinking about for myself, okay, so like in the context of border support, you need you need things that are clearly resource redistribution, trying to leave it's like the groups that leave water and canned food in drop-off sites, people who do search and rescue work, who patrol the deserts and things like that. So I coming from my experience, that's what I did over in Greece, but on the sea. And so the question I got left with is like, so then how do you build community like in a situation like this where you're clearly coming in with a higher positionality of power, right? As someone coming, like not themselves going through the migration experience, and trying to support those who are going through it. I'm coming in at a higher status of power. So then how do I actually then join and see this work as reciprocity, right? And this is where I start thinking about in your zine, where you start talking about border towns, and the extension of the borders through different border towns in our civil societies. And you gave one example about a group of a raid that was happening and how certain members of the local organization knew that the raid was happening but didn't share this information and what that meant. And for me, that became an example of like that tension of like, are you mutual aid? Are you a charity? Are you sustaining the power, or are you actually disrupting the power in any way you can? Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could talk more to us about one, that incident, and two, just like your experience in border towns and that like tense relationship between charity, mutual aid, and resource distribution, especially in a space like migration where all three are really needed.
Yeah, that project came out of an anthology where a comrade, Kristian Williams, asked me to write something about counterinsurgency theory. And it felt important to me to think about the border and border enforcement as a part of um, state enforcement of categories of power and identity. I mean, I think it seems maybe I mean, it no longer seems hyperbolic to talk about the internalization of the border as a way to manage population controls within the state identity. Maybe 10 years ago, when I wrote solely in the border regions, because the legal categories that existed for how they could use hard and soft controls only were present when you were different. The speed with which they could deport you, the conditions of detention, that was really a zine about the internalization of the border, and it was kind of a warning for folks in the interior about what was coming down the line. And we very much arrived to that reality. At the time, there was a feeling that certain bodies were being policed, and that obviously was a gendered and racialized and class experience, and that it was possible to live in the border town and not realize that there was a raid happening in the southern part of the city that was a paramilitary collaboration between different state and municipal agencies. I mean, that's just how privilege and power work, right? I think the reason that people who are interested in state power and citizen identity spend so much time talking, thinking, and writing about the border is that it makes explicit power differentials in exchange that actually exist everywhere, if you're looking for them. So, this is true of anti-prison and prisoner support work we do. I mean, the tendrils of the way that the state maintains its authority over all of us, they exist in every community. And if you look, they're not so hidden, right? And I don't know how much you want to get into it about like actual counterinsurgency or low intensity conflict theory itself. I mean, I will say that it's important to understand why things have coalesced the way they have. Neoliberal policies also happened concurrently with sealing of the border cities, pushing people out into more geographically remote areas. Like, why was I able to be a part of a collective that provides care in remote geographical locations? It's because people have been pushed out to more remote areas to make that journey. And I think it's important to understand border enforcement as management, and not the goal actually isn't that nobody is able to cross a boundary. The goal is that populations can be controlled through the threat of explicit violence or the kind of implicit, like, kind of softer controls that people experience in their life around identity policing and access to work. So I think that understanding the expansion of the border infrastructure um, that happened in the 90s, and then also understanding the ways that state itself will recuperate and take on language of saving lives, and that using and mirroring back our language to us is a part of counterinsurgency itself. It's the ideological part of it. I think if you look at the strategies of enforcement that agencies like ICE or Border Patrol use, it seems kind of bizarre to then look at their HR or their like public facing language about what they're doing, and they'll tell you that they're saving lives, which is
Mhm.
totally bizarre. Because if you look at the conditions that people are held into detention, and what people are experiencing through the practice of dusting groups, scattering people intentionally, watching people cross, knowing that they're lost, not picking them up, refusing to participate in search and rescue. Like, why does a civilian-led search and rescue group exist? Because the military infrastructure is not utilized for life saving for certain bodies. They'll pull out all the stops for a white hiker but they won't do that for racialized bodies. So these things are all very clear at the border. And then through a process of internalization, they've just become something now that exists in every city. And the levels of participatory enforcement that people are expected to normalize, that's the era that we're in now. And
Mhm.
there's lots of reasons for it. I mean, I think just the commodification of misery and the way that they've been able to kind of segue the big infrastructural prison boom that happened during the drug war, and then they have the infrastructure, and then they need more bodies. And so, I like reminding people that, immigration status was something the US dealt with as a civil issue up until very recent. It actually none of these procedures moved into a criminal judicial process. And that really is a trend that's changed in the last 15 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
When I was doing research for that article, I discovered that illegal re-entry was the top prosecuted federal charge in the US and has been since like 2011. That just means like someone was present without the correct documentation according to the state, and that they had previously tried to enter the country and been flagged
mm-hmm,
for it. But I think understanding why we're at this current moment that we're in, I wrote that zine under the Obama administration for a reason. And anyone who has an anarchist perspective isn't hanging their hat on some hope that the Democrats will come up with reasonable, humane border policy, which is a contradiction in itself. But I think it's important to understand that the heavy fascist hand of the state was gifted previous Democratic administrations.
mm-hmm,
Famously, Obama deported more people than any other administration. But I think if you look at the ways and moved from an ICE facility into a private prison to do time and were then sent back to an ICE facility and then deported. So, the projects like Operation Streamline were just an early precursor to a categorical shift of criminalizing bodies in a very specific way.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're starting to see a different
Yeah,
manifestation.
no, absolutely. And I think the crime itself is existing without the paperwork that the state deems to be legitimate. And right now it's all pivoting kind of overnight, where previous categories like green card holders, visa holders, folks who had received permissions to study in this country, like all of a sudden those categories are being linked in with a large mixed status and an undocumented population in the US. And that was always going to happen. you know, that was always going to come down the line, because they found ways to profit off of
Mm-hmm,
incarceration. And it was always very much by design. I mean, you end up sounding kind of conspiratorial when you're talking about the way that the state acts upon bodies, but the corporations that run private prisons literally wrote all of these laws and then they help spread them. Things like the American Legislative Exchange Council, where private corporate interests and legislators literally get together and write laws so that they're then passed concurrently in all states.
mm-hmm,
It's kind of the boring but very important details of like why these new regiments of control kind of all happen at the same time. So I think we're in a really weird moment where how municipal, state, and federal enforcement, they're not all necessarily going to align because there's a lot of different interests.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
stay tuned. It's going to be weird. I will say your original question about that raid, when federal, state, and local law enforcement agents wearing balaclavas and carrying semi-automatic weapons went door to door asking people for papers. And, it wasn't even initially clear to a lot of these families that they weren't just being robbed by masked gunmen. And that is the moment that we're in again, accounts
Mm-hmm.
of people being held at gunpoint and children being told to say goodbye to their parents. It's a very dark time, and I think just as we're talking about the externalization of border enforcement, doesn't just happen on the southern US-Mexico border, has through things like the Meridia Initiative and other investments. The militarization of the southern Mexican border has been something that the US has been vested in. And you can see the same kind of externalization of border enforcement that happens in Europe through certain Schengen agreements and facilities that exist in Eastern Europe. You know, it's the regiments function pretty similarly. In Europe, you're supposed to declare your intent for asylum, but you have to do it in the first Schengen country that you set foot in. So
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, doing no border work in Europe, I met a bunch of people who had like asylum status in Romania, but they were trying from France to get into the UK. And so this process of kind of letting outlier states do your dirty work for you, incarcerate populations and force, it has precedent in Fortress Europe, and it's certainly what's happening as well with kind of terrifying ascension of things like publicly acknowledged torture prisons in El Salvador. So,
Yeah.
and we are in a specifically terrifying moment, but like, is it without precedent? I mean, I don't think, I was politicized in an era right before and right after 9/11. And, There was definitely a period where people were disappearing and nobody knew where they were going. And it turns out, in hindsight, that there was extraordinary rendition to secret torture prisons in Syria happening. We didn't know that at the time. But,
Yeah.
is this a really discursively different moment that we've been in, or is this just a kind of like more intense expression of it? I think anyone, you could ask the family whose child died of the flu at Dilley Family Detention Center in Texas a few years ago if they feel we're in a different moment. I just think that this is where we have been, and people haven't wanted to look at it.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you on that. Uh, it's a moment where, yeah, for those of us who've already been engaged in this work at some level or know people or impacted this, or ourselves impacted, this isn't necessarily new. And right, like the terminology of trying to blame one administration or one party over another plays into this rhetoric of like it's only bad now. But I think what your zine and your work and what we're talking about right now actually like really point out is like where we are at this moment doesn't come out of nowhere. We've already been in practice. It's just been more hidden, and now it's ready to come out full force. And it leaves open the question of like, well, how have we ourselves engaged in this in this current manifestation without even realizing that we're part of it, right? The concept of like hard power and soft power that you keep coming back to in the zine, I thought was really powerful. I think it's a very interesting way of like looking at how we got into this moment because yeah, there's the obvious stuff that you talk about within the hard power, which is the jails, the funding of ICE agents, the laws that allowed for cooperation between the different law enforcements and ICE agents, and the standardization of their like violent practices. But then there's the soft power, which I don't think we look at enough with ourselves and within our communities and how we're perpetuating. And so like right now, right in the mainstream rhetoric, you hear like, oh, but this person is not a criminal, and this person is not a criminal, and this is a father, and using these identities, which are essentially supposed to label someone as worthy or not. And whether this person basically gets the public support that they deserve or not based on these various labels. And this is, I think, right where mutual aid really tries to challenge that, where you don't have to have a specific title, a specific identity, a specific positionality for you to be deserving, that no matter who you are and where you're coming from, you are deserving of support, of love, of the basic things that you need to survive in life. But part of the tactic, right, like is really standing out for me for out of your zine is like the deterioration of that concept of like, in order for ICE to be able to do what it's doing, the rest of society has to basically submit to the idea that there are those of us that are deserving versus those of us who are not. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. Counterinsurgency theory on the border distinguishes between categories of people who are deserving of leniency and those who are criminal. And this distinction, which like underlies the liberal idea of humane border policy, is that, some people get a reprieve from hard controls like deportation, but they don't actually challenge the control regime. And they're actually an integral part of it, disguising controls within the fabric of everyday life and cloaking them in narratives of human rights and like liberalism is an important part of social management. And I think that hard controls like imprisonment and abuse in custody are carried out by a relatively few number of people, right? But soft controls are enacted by pretty much everyone. Every social worker who reports, every nurse who allows a transfer of a patient into Border Patrol custody, each person who drives past a police traffic stop without inquiring, like these are all examples of compliance. So does every activist who reinforces deserving and undeserving categories in their community campaign, and every community organizer who agrees to work with ICE to fight trafficking. So I think inadvertent participation in low intensity warfare is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. We've all found ourselves complicit at one point or another out of ignorance, naivete, fear, a sense of futility or despair. And I think this is kind of the Foucauldian concept of participatory regimes of control that makes people really uncomfortable because they're much harder to wrap your head around. You know, I think the border lands are a vision of the future, but the future has like when I wrote the zine they were, but now that vision has arrived.
Yeah.
And it's not a nice one. It's one of state and paramilitary violence, expanding police power, volatile racial exchanges, mass incarceration. But it is also, the border is a contested and ever-changing territory. It isn't under the total jurisdiction of any one group at one all the time. Military theorists are worried about legitimacy because it is produced through social narratives that are not absolute. And I think, you know, I wrote about the border 10 years ago because the state was losing its mask of humane governance, and more people were seeing methods of social control for what they are. And we're certainly in that moment again. You know, the more economically and ecologically unstable the world becomes, the more alternative visions of social organization and struggles that might make them a reality will be given credence. And I think, it's kind of wild to think about something that could theoretically be a politically posited as resource redistribution as being an explicitly political exchange, but mutual aid is a focus of state enforcement for a reason. Why are your friends who are giving recycled food to unhoused folks in the park constantly ticketed and arrested by the police? Why is that a site of enforcement? You know, I think, and it's because it really does genuinely disrupt the mechanisms through which they control populations, which is about access to housing, food, healthcare. If you get
Mm-hmm.
your needs met outside of normative structures of exchange, if you're not stuck in debt cycles, if you're not, leveraged up to your eyeballs and you don't have to go to a job you fucking hate every day,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a lot harder to control a population.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think anyone making an appeal to get their loved one back and extolling and counteracting a narrative of criminality is trying to throw anybody else under a bus. But it is what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think who is deserving of our compassion, who is deserving of our solidarity, of limited resources, it's sometimes important to determine what across the board, more or less, the requirements of mutual exchange, if only so that you can have that work done in an equitable way and you're accountable to that. That is different than delineating that there are some people who deserve or don't deserve certain amounts of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's as we're talking here, I'm thinking about like the how important rhetoric is in order to create these separations in identity and community and cause ruptures in community. And one of the ways mutually counters that is by the fact that because you're embedded within community, you're building relationships. These rhetorics of criminal or unsafety or like constant panic are less likely to get hold, right? Because you know who your neighbors are, you know who you're engaging with and who you're working with, and so these grand speeches, in order to invoke panic within the general society, become less believable, and like the facade of what they are, which is to create panic in order to create a more militarized police state, becomes abundantly like obvious, um, and so like
Yeah.
it's this other way of working of like us working to build our relationship is not only to take care of each other, but it's also to basically reinforce us against these horrible rhetorics that try to cause division and chaos among us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the main ideological ways that the state produces compliance for a really heightened level of militarization and enforcement of our society is by creating fear, right? So
Mm-hmm,
fighting the
mm-hmm,
drug war, narco-insurgency, the racialization of certain bodies as criminal. These are all things that the current administration has utilized in order to get regular citizens to fear their neighbors. Um, and, you know, it's only effective if people aren't actually in community with each other
mm-hmm.
and don't know each other. And you as society is pretty atomized. So, that might be the case for some people, but, you know, it's, I think for me, the example of what does narco-insurgency as a narrative mean for policy? Like, if narco violence used to be a new ascending form of terrorism that was used to justify more border infrastructure, agents on the ground, internal controls, partnering with Mexico and Central America to fight against cartels, but like the actual state military infrastructure and resources went into creating a paramilitary structure in those places that then turned around and became uh, an increasing part of the narco insurgency. I mean, it's counterinsurgency is needed to fight the narco insurgency that threatens the power of the state so skillfully because cartels like the Zetas were trained by the US in counterinsurgency. So fighting the narco insurgency is a perfect excuse for maintaining the narco insurgency. And this isn't like an example that's unique just to the failed state that exists in certain parts of Mexico. I mean, I think we're really seeing like the preponderance of arms and the breakdown of state legitimacy. We've arrived in certain parts of the US as well. So I think people really need to problematize the narratives that they're being, spoon-fed. And mutual aid resists those kind of hyperbolic narratives because it encourages people to see others in an individual relational way. So, and I do think that that's one of the things that actually distinguishes grassroots mutual aid projects from NGO management as well. Like, I maintain connections with and know folks who work in international aid as a career because I do find it somewhat advantageous sometimes to resource share and occasionally try to connect folks. NGOs control a lot of resources in conflict zones internationally, and we know that. But I think for me, what distinguishes humanitarian aid, mutual aid from a more population-based perspective is that collectives that I'm a part of look at someone's like desires, needs, their goals, their autonomy individually and situation by situation. And when you talk about people who do international level NGO work, they're talking about managing populations in tens, 20s, 30, 50,000. They're not able to parse down to individual autonomy and desire. And the situation has become so dire for folks in that situation that no one's in a position to challenge them. And I think this is what distinguishes a mutual solidarity from an NGO being folded into conflict management. Is like you still have to take into account what the person in front of you is telling you their desired goal is out of the exchange. And you're there to facilitate somebody else's informed decision. You're not there to provide a minimal level of subsistence survival and ignore any of their other needs.
Yeah. Yeah, just reflecting on what you're bringing in, I think like this idea of having to look at the person as a whole, the community as a whole, and not picking and choosing what needs are appropriate, what's not, and what you're going to meet versus not. And it is this process of constantly checking one's power and position and to be willing to so going back to the incident in the zine again, with the raid, I mean, it's a part that I really kind of sat and reflected on a lot because I thought it's such a powerful retelling of like the tensions that are happening. So I found myself thinking about, okay, well, if you were in the organizer's shoes, right? Like, why would I choose to keep this information from the community that I'm serving versus why not share the information, right? And where I landed was that it's this trust in the community's autonomy versus lack of, meaning that if I'm someone working in an NGO and I'm working with serving a community and I have this information, do I believe that in the community itself in order to make a decision for itself and do what it needs to do to protect itself? Or do I feel this need to protect, right? Or infantilize them. So like in one section you talked, like you quoted someone saying like they were afraid that the community would panic, right? So it's like, why would we assume that the community would panic versus the community could prepare itself for what's coming next, right? And what's kind of landed on is like there's this, I think for me a difference in the in charity versus mutual aid is that in this moment where there is a discrepancy in power, are you still able to relinquish whatever power you have to the community and trust in the community to do what it needs to do for itself and not have decisions made for them versus believing that like, oh, well, I know better how to serve this community. And so I will do what I need to do for them. Right. And in the case that you shared, the way it lands for me is that these organizers didn't fully trust in the community's autonomy. And so a decision was made for the community rather than information widely shared for the community to decide itself. And so like, again, it's like this constant like internal power struggle, it seems like that happens like at an individual level between those in charity versus those engaging in mutual aid. And the goal of being to continue practicing mutual aid is to constantly then notice these moments where you may have power over and be willing to step away from that, relinquishing that to put it back into the community to help build autonomy.
Exactly. And also to acknowledge that you can be used if you aren't creating relationships of trust, being transparent, giving information when you have it. You can be used as a social manager. You can be used as a form of self-control. I mean, the community relations personnel was attempting to reach out to community leaders because they wanted to create quote unquote good relationships and were playing nice, but it was just a spin tactic. Obviously, you can only be used if you allow yourself to participate in the law-abiding, deserving migrant versus criminal element narrative that's often used to manufacture support for ICE. And when those distinctions are upheld by community organizers and human rights advocates and other social managers, they just basically are an extension of the state. And I think in that moment, holding on to information, which is holding on to power, is problematic. And I think people get uncomfortable reflecting on the ways that inevitably at some point they will probably participate in a soft control. Because constantly pushing back against every soft control that is really woven into daily life is exhausting and requires strategic and conceptual strength. And you have to know, and you have to practice, and you have to be in community, and you have to be willing to take risk. And you have to position yourself in relationship to your societal power, and you have to be willing to give up a certain amount of safety and comfort. And there's a lot of reasons that not everyone is willing to do that. But if you've chosen to participate in mutual aid as part of a political identity, then you really are staking a claim there that you've thought about it, you've strategized about it, you've come up with reflective safety planning, and that you're willing to take the risk. And I think it's well past the time when these are the kinds of things people should be considering together.
Yeah. I think this is a good transition point to your piece on resiliency and care. What we're talking about right now is, that inner work, letting go of our inner ego are the things that hold us back and give us a sense of security based on our sense of power and positionality. And the counter of that is the quote unquote sacrificial self, right? Giving everything you have, even at the complete expense of yourself and others. And how that's essentially idolized in a lot of ways in our movements as oh, well, the counter individualism is complete, total self-sacrifice. And in this piece, you push back against that. And I appreciate that because I kind of sit in a similar place where it's I'm all about giving the self to the collective, but also there is how are you also feeding yourself? Because the idea of sacrificing just to sacrifice itself is not, to me, revolutionary at all. I want to enjoy the revolution and be part of the post as much as I want to be part of the fight now. and that requires us to be able to take moments to step back and do what we need to do for ourselves, which is very different than the whitewashed self-care Saturdays or Sundays, whatever it is, whatever day of the week it is for self-care. And something that joked around a lot in whitewashed movements of like joy is resistance. It's like, yeah, joy is resistance, but not at the expense of others, right? So this piece, I appreciated like that tension of taking the step back, acknowledging within our movements the importance of people needing to fluctuate in their bandwidth and how much they're able to give, and that it's totally okay to be like a wave. There's moments where you're really intense and you're really in it, and there's other times where you're pulling back. And in those pullbacks, it's like your moments to kind of refuel yourself and re-energize yourself. And the question that like came up is like, how do we then build our movements to support that instead of just relying on basically running at full steam ahead until we're all burnt down to the ground?
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote that piece because a friend was writing a book that touched on some of those themes and sent me a prompt about it and just wanted to know how I had continued to engage in social movement work over the decades for such a long period of time. And the funny thing about that was that I actually hadn't, is that I'd gone through this period of burnout and had stepped back from a lot of the frontline work that I'd been doing out of necessity. And I think that in the process of identity shift and change, because I used to derive a lot of my self-worth from the political work that I engaged with and being in collective kind of relationship and offering and being a resource and providing, critical care to folks and being able to navigate extremely intense situations constantly. And you can't actually engage with all of the horrors of the world and not at some point experience some kind of physical exhaustion, just like, and then you have no more cortisol, and then you yourself are in a mental health crisis. And I think it can be hard for a specific kind of person, and I would include myself in this, who is used to really being on top of their shit and getting to be the resource, to accept care and to ask for help and to take a step away. I mean, we're constantly understanding how we are in some ways privileged or not in relationship to our class, gender, racial identities. But there is a physicality to the work, and I think anarchists have really big hearts, and they open themselves up to a lot of secondary trauma. And I think coming up with a purposeful and intentional practice to deal with secondary trauma as a serious engagement is an essential and important part of the work that we do. Because if you don't, then you're going to go hard when you're young, and then you're going to disengage from movement work as you age, and we're not going to have the kind of resilient intergenerational collaborations, and we're not going to be able to pass on experiences, wisdom, or have intergenerational exchange, and our movements will be worse off for them. So, I think how you take time for healing and how you work against social isolation, if engagement in frontline work is where you have your social connections and you're not able to do that work anymore, where does that leave you? And how are you maintaining social relationships in community? I don't think that we've solved these issues. For me, it mostly comes down to the feminization of care work and what kinds of labor within social movements are considered valorized, and what labor is just kind of not acknowledged. So, I have a pretty helpful concept of cumulative moral injury. I know how to work through singular traumatic experiences. I used to work in the emergency room. I've done a lot of field work as a humanitarian aid worker, and I feel like secondary trauma was the thing I learned to manage. But the experience of burnout over time, when it's cumulative, was not something that I found myself able to deal with. So, and understanding the causal reasons that you're experiencing something isn't the same as trying to reduce working more than full time in the ER and the ICU during COVID when I was also pregnant and able to do during a period of increased social isolation because of that COVID risk. So I think, and just watching like so many people die over like a course of a period of time. And when I was looking at collective understandings of harm and trauma, they're just, you can contextualize your feelings. You can read, like sociodiagnostics by Fanon from 1967 that identified colonialism as itself being the pathological agent. You can understand all these things at like a meta level. Then like, what is your actual plan for clawing your way back from profound physical and emotional exhaustion? How are you going to restructure your life, restructure your relationships, and create space for healing? And I think sometimes there's a lot of residual shame about it, because going from needing tending and needing support when historically you were the person offering it is very humbling. So, and I think people end up feeling that their social use has come to an end, and that like people in their lives won't value them unless they're bringing some kind. It's weird the way that we're still very like social currency and exchange based in the way that we think about the work that we do. And for me, I just came to a point where I said, well, what advice would I give myself? I have to give myself the grace, and I have to extend to myself the graciousness that I would encourage my friends and comrades to have for themselves. We can't hold responsibility for all the world's atrocities, and we can't always redress all the harm that we're surrounded by. And also, if you value your capacity for empathy and your capacity for resistance, then you really have to make time for it. So I don't have like a prescriptive solution to offer, but I will just say that I would like to imagine a community realm where changing engagement is understood as necessary sometimes instead of being judged. When people tell me stories of cutting ties and reducing engagement in social movements, I think they're telling me a story about a changing need that they had in their life that the community couldn't accommodate. And I think that we don't necessarily have a language for it. I think I've definitely lived in other places in the world where the fabric of the community was a little more tied into daily life. But that's not always how resistance movements feel in the US.
Yeah, this piece got me thinking about how different structures of mutual aid groups really make a huge difference in how the members of the group are themselves able to sustain themselves, not just the work, but at an individual level. And that even if a group, like going back to the borders, right? Let's say there's a mutual aid collective doing border work. The mutual aid is not only present between like the work that the group is doing with migrants, but it's also the way that they're able to support one another in the work, in the witnessing of the secondhand trauma, in the workload and the urgency of the moment, and our personal needs, our physical needs, our mental needs, our spiritual needs. And that again, it becomes like a difference, I think, for me that starts to stand out between charity work is that like this investment in the full being. And there does have to be like this, like you're saying, this flexibility in how we're able to like meet the various needs that everyone have, and like make more space for different generations, different perspectives, not just like differences in race and class, but also generationally, so that we do have relationships with our elders and those younger with us, and there's a reciprocity in the sharing of the knowledge and in our collective experience. But like what you're describing is very similar, like for yourself is a very similar experience to my like self, where it's like there's a certain point where like a huge pride in my identity was my ability to like just go in there and like be support to people and go until I couldn't go anymore. And that shift or like that, like in it, like the forced shutdown was identity breaking, resource breaking, like all the things breaking, and forced me to kind of sit there and think about like, well, if I can't go as fast as I can, am I now useless to this community? Do I get thrown out? And am I even like, is this an actual political community if I can't even be here in like in all my phases, right? Um, and so like, and it kind of starts to open up the question of like our intergenerational relationships and um like in the various ways that we could exist with one another, not just all able-bodied or all this type of person or this type of
Yeah.
thing or
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, I think going through, um, going through a profound experience of burnout and coming out on the other side, I can think about the change that really took place over a long period of time. I stayed engaged with the political collective that I've been a part of, but the work that I did for them changed and certainly was reduced. And also, I do think that there's something that happens as you continue to engage in something over time where, like, I no longer need to be a keystone for any project that I'm in. If I'm able to take long periods of time away from the collective work I'm engaged with and it can continue without me and I can just plug in relationship to like how much work I can sustain, that's actually really a win for me. It requires a little bit of like taming of the ego, and I have to accept collective decisions occurring in my absence that maybe
mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be super happy about. And in some ways, it is intergenerational because the direction of any collective I'm a part of can go to a place that I might not have steered it because it's probably not up to me. And if you don't necessarily have time to engage in the very time intensive collective decision making structures that we utilize, you kind of have to be okay with that. And I think a lot of our collective structures that want to use non-hierarchical decision making, that is kind of a pressure point, right? Like who has time to sit in meetings that last for hours? And I can tell you it's not working parents,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So it's mostly young people and folks who are retired. So how are you going to fill in all of the like midlife resources and reflections and experiences that people could bring to your work if they were able to be accommodated in the phase of life that they're in, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
and I think the identity shattering that happens when you step away from something that really anchored, like just like your purpose for being in life. I think for me, the political work that I engaged with was a lot of how I counterbalanced my mental health struggles. It was, border work was part of why I was able to live in a border regime. It was making my peace with the suffering and enforcement that I continually saw around me. It was, the reason I was able to engage in really intense moments with people when I was um, providing them medical care during like the worst experience of their life. And I think um, you have to come up with other coping mechanisms. If your answer for how you feel about the world isn't going to be constant 110% engagement with the structures that exist, then you need to find like a slower pace and another way to be. And I think losing a sense of urgency about the work that I did was something that happened a long time ago for me because the need is a chasm, and I don't just mean that in relationship to humanitarian aid work, you know, it's just as true in being in community with unhoused neighbors or providing free medical care for folks. Like, there will never be an end to the need that gets determined. But like just because you can meet someone's need doesn't have to be you all of the time, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's easy for me to say, ah, yes, the feminization of care work and radical identity that requires that we engage in community labor. But when you're backed up into that corner, like, do you have to be that person all of the
Yep.
time just because
Yeah.
the hurt, the pain, the need, and the request is there? Um, how do you draw boundaries around what you offer? And how do you also ask for support and care when you need it? And, I do think there's a pruning of relationships that occur during certain life events. So, like, for example, I had a baby a few years ago. That was
Mm.
like a pruning event in my life. Um, it changed the way that I engage in my relationships, and like some relationships fell off, some are really deepened. And I think it's true, maybe like the abundant social relationships that people find themselves able to participate in when they're young, changes as you age. And I think that that's actually okay. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we shouldn't think of ourselves in terms of like political expediency. Like that is the mutual part of mutual aid. Like if I only have meaning and relationship for the like politically resourced thing or the medically resourced thing that I could offer, and like absent of that use, I am nothing in our relationship. Are we really
Right.
comrades? Are we really friends? Like,
Yep. Yep.
are we going to continue in this? And that's the mutuality of it, that that comes up. Like, are you there in my moment of crisis and need? And some people will be, and some people won't be. And mediating that in a collective sense, I think, is something that people are fairly bad at.
Yep. No, it's true. It's I mean, it's kind of one of the big contradictions in our movements, right? It's like we see ourselves valuable and worthy as long as we have something to offer. But if we become someone in need, then there's something wrong with us, right? And I think you're right where you're speaking to like mutual aid is like again forcing this on its head, where it's like no, there shouldn't be stipulations. There shouldn't be like if this then that. It's simply that how we're showing up and like holding space for the various phases of ourselves in our variety of existence, and I think the final piece that you had shared with us, it was not an unexpected death, the piece on crime thing, really spoke to this as well, and also the tension of like harm reduction and enabling, right, and the tensions that we could kind of feel, where it's like, what does it mean to show up for someone where they're at the moment while also wanting more for them and for yourselves and for the relationship and the interpersonal conflict that rises up with that. First up, thank you for writing such a beautifully heartfelt piece, sharing your experience with your friend in the piece and just your process of moving through the loss and the tensions and the relationship. I mean, this is like, yeah, I'm curious for you, like how harm reduction has played in your various roles within the spaces that you've existed, and your experience with just not trying to replicate the same stereotypes and the power dynamics within the hegemonic system, but also holding for something different and pushing for that.
Mm. Yeah, that was a piece that I wrote over the course of a few years. I initially wrote portions of it for my friend's memorial, and then I kind of revisited it a few years later and added more political contextualization. So my best friend growing up, we met when we were like, I was 12 and she was 14.
Mm.
And I was in my late 20s, early 30s when she died. And we'd gone through a period of estrangement, which I think is pretty common with addiction. And like a lot of the ways that I work through grief is by understanding the historical context that created the situation that I find myself in, which
Mm-hmm.
maybe is a coping mechanism related to overly intellectualizing things. But
May know a thing or two about that.
but it was helpful to me as someone, I had been an IV drug user in my late teens. And I actually didn't have a lot of regrets about that period of my life because I understood that coping mechanism as something that really bridged me from being on antidepressants and antipsychotic medication, self-medicating through street drug use, and then finding myself with healthier coping mechanisms and going through a period of little like being politicized where I was able to contextualize a lot of my pain and understand it in a wider societal context, and then finding purposeful engagement in the world where I had more autonomy and control over my life circumstances. And that was kind of the arc and course of how I personally dealt with maladaptive coping mechanisms and addiction in my life. And then my best friend had a different course in life, struggled for, decades with addiction, and it eventually killed her. And we were in, continual dialogue about that process. And I tried lots of interventions to try to support her living the life she wanted to live. And I think it was important for me to come out of that process of grief, not seeing what had happened as a failure. And I've discussed this with comrades and friends over the years. I was at a prisoner support conference maybe 15 years ago where we talked about what made people really vulnerable to state surveillance and infiltration. And for me, it was that our movements don't always acknowledge the emotional needs that cause people to seek out community and participate in political work. And then there can be a pretty easy route to betrayal if those emotional needs aren't met. And it's not acknowledged that people join our movements for a sense of purpose and belonging and that relational exchange. And I think that people the question of autonomy, people get to live the lives that they live. And I think for me, my changing feelings about harm reduction had to do with what is a life well lived? It's important not to stigmatize people because stigma kills, but then there's that continued conversation about well, what kind of life do you want to live? Why do you want to be numb to the world as it exists? And, obviously the answer to that is because people experience trauma, and not feeling anything is a coping mechanism. I had a period of estrangement with my friend of about 5 years before she died. And so we weren't in dialogue and communication, and there were periods of guilt about that after she died. And I think there was something missing for me politically and didn't discuss more than just reducing stigma and allowing people to continue maladaptive coping mechanisms. It's the same as defining mutual aid by what it isn't. What life do you want to live? How do you want to be in relationship to the earth? What are your social relationships? And it's about judgment, and it's really corrosive to the social fabric and those relationships. And I think for me, I had to come to terms with a failure on my part to maintain an intimate relationship when it wasn't mutually sustaining. And I think this is in some ways related to the political work that we do as well, because it's that relationship started to feel to me like I was my friend's social worker. And there was no reciprocity, there was no mutualism. We weren't building anymore, we weren't exchanging, and you can get into those kinds of diametrically opposed relationships to people when they struggle with addiction. And you struggle with capacity. And I think having not had that other conversation about the broader one, the visioning one of what do you want for yourself in life and how can you get there? And maybe that's a utopian vision that won't really exist, right? I think for me, politically, harm reduction is important, but I don't envision a world where people need to anesthetize themselves to their life every day. And it felt taboo to say that this isn't what I would want for myself or for somebody else in a way. And it's hard to say that because it sounds judgmental, and you don't want to reify shame. But it's not necessarily different than the conversation we had about burnout and creating spaces for healing. I just don't think that we all know how to do this work. It's also important to say that my friend's death was one among 100,000 that happened in the last decade and a half, and that there are reasons that this specific experience of addiction has been commodified for profit. I mean, it was also for a myriad of reasons, the odds were stacked against survival.
Yeah. I found myself also thinking about the judgment piece a lot, and kind of replaying that scenario that your position gives, what kind of life is a life worth living? And the question of well, if someone wants to do that's how they want to live their life, is that necessarily a life not worth a good life worth living? like noticing like the parts of me that was like judgment or trying to understand, but not being able to understand. And also being someone who like enjoys taking drugs and who also uses like drugs to also self-medicate. Kind of also finding this curiosity of like, well, what does a world look like where you're not using drugs to placate, to numb things out, but truly as a choice, which I don't know if I could say that I've done that, you know? The like watching the parts of me that's kind of feels like stereotype, like, oh no, drugs are bad versus the part that wants like total freedom and autonomy. And so how do you support that autonomy while also recognizing, right, like you're saying over and over again in the piece of like, there are root causes to the pain, and providing safe needles, safe places to do things, access to Narcan might help reduce the harm, but like, is that actually harm reduction? Harm reduction for me is tackling the actual root causes. And like you're saying, building this alternative that this is not something that you have to do because you can't, like existing in life as it is just too much to bear.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think a conversation about maladaptive coping mechanisms can't happen without a conversation about like adaptive coping mechanisms. And I don't think that drugs and mind-altering substances fall on one side of that line or the other, actually. I mean, I think that we'll be seeing an ascendant, literature of the benefits of psychobacillin or other kinds of mind-altering substances that actually do facilitate healing, much the way that like somatic practices that bring people back into their body and allow them to be present. So I think, it's a false dualism. I just think also like, I think where I got to it was having a lot of compassion for my teenage self, right? And like a life lived in defiance of norms did seem holy to me. And also, the punk gods of our youth have been sold like self-destruction isn't disruptive to the social fabric. It's been co-opted. So it's hard to exist in a carceral society, and that a lot of us put worth in resistance, also don't make space for regenerative healing or time in nature. And so it makes sense. Like, I think this is mediation that you and I were describing when we discussed the work that we've been doing, and the fact that people need a break to feel nothing, those things aren't unrelated.
Yeah.
And yes, there are people like my friend who never got to the place of social conflict because she lost the battle within herself years before. But I think that we can't talk about things like, I mean, no one's talking about bringing down the social order anymore. I'm dating myself with that language, but like we can talk about surviving the collapse of certain societal structures and the social safety net being completely dismantled, and being in defiance to enforcement regimens that have brutal consequences for dissent. And then we're going to have to talk about wellness. We're going to have to talk about imbalance. We're going to have to talk about mental health and how we deal with crisis. And I also think like, I exist in a realm where harm reduction has been professionalized. I mean, I really do. In the medical work that I do as a healthcare worker. And, stigma exists. Like, I would say I don't share with the majority of my colleagues that I used to be an IV drug user and I work in harm reduction. Now, there would be a lot of salient reasons not to overshare with, a client, and we can talk about the false dualisms of professionalism and the barriers that they place between you and someone else and their suffering. And I think like that piece also touched on this. Like I wrote this piece when I was existing in a professional realm in relationship to harm reduction in a way that I hadn't in the past. I mean, I've been involved in harm reduction for 20 years, and initially it's all volunteer, right? It's a grassroots movement of people who active drug users sharing resources in order to help each other survive. And now it's really been taken on in certain places and co-opted and gone through an NGO process and gone through a professionalization that doesn't really speak to how we're in relationship with each other. So I think like the question for me that still exists is like, how vulnerable do you make yourself? How do you show up in relationship, and then like where are you drawing boundaries around how much you offer up, what that exchange is and what it isn't, and I think that kind of speaks to a much more complicated truth, which is that unless you decide to be a paid organizer, you're going to have to figure out a way to like sustain yourself whilst also
Mm-hmm.
doing political work. And
Mm-hmm.
that some of the skills that we all want to obtain in this world require professional training, or we're not going to have those skills
Yeah.
because they can't be DIY. They don't exist completely within a realm that we could be autodidactic, you know. So
Yeah.
when talking about and struggling with and working through addiction with someone in my life with whom I had a personal relationship, um, I found that I'm really good at harm reduction in a professional capacity, and like in my personal life, I really struggle with it.
Yeah.
And I think because investment does sometimes involve judgment because you're like intimately intertwined in someone's maladaptive coping mechanisms and it's negatively impacting your life. And you don't have to bring all of those complications in to a more professional relationship and exchange, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I do think sometimes the approaches we've been taking to harm reduction can feel a little bit naive because but also sometimes it's structural. Like if you're helping people survive and then survive to what end, and then like what's on the receiving end, like where are the harm reduction oriented programs that help people who want to achieve sobriety? Where can people find coping mechanisms to deal with trauma that aren't so harmful? And can we talk about the harm involved in drug use in a way that doesn't stigmatize?
Mm. Yeah. And I think those same questions really kind of copy paste on like all our different spaces, right? Like I'm thinking about the same questions go to like our migrant neighbors at the border and like how we engage with them, those who have been incarcerated, anyone who's essentially been othered by the system, right? It's like how are we showing up and engaging in a way that counters this othering and helps us build non-judgmental relationships to even if we don't understand what the other person is going through or experiencing, um, we could still accept it and for what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first got involved in humanitarian aid work, I was pretty agnostic, um, and I still am. But I've definitely been in community with and doing work with faith-based um, organizers way more than I ever would have told you that I was going
Mm,
to 20 years ago, Um, I just for like political and cultural reasons, in my personal family life, religion is very related to state power controlling fascism. But but there is, there's like a liberation theology kind of like soft, softer approach to faith. And I think about this sometimes as a parent, like what are the values that I wish to impart to my children? Well, I want some kind of like compassionate humanism initially, like we'll really develop the like critique of the state and the caution against co-option and kind of like the nuances of strategy and tactics like much further down the line. But like in the early years, like I just want to teach and create a safe environment for like extending connection and care and and to not others of people who are different than you. Like it's kind of funny. Parenting kind of involves coming to terms with all of your ideological values and then trying to figure out like how do you create someone with critical thinking skills who will develop their own mores and develop their own kind of system of beliefs. It's not just a transference. It's not just a photocopy. Like that's not how it works. So
mhm.
I think, and and it really comes down, to some kind of like soft cell humanism, just like feeling a lot of compassion and curiosity and interest and care for other people in the world. And I think it's hard to maintain that level of openness to the world because of all the systems that exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. Like holding that it's a balance, right? Holding the openness and the possibility as well, also setting the boundaries that allow you to continue to grow and push beyond them, you know?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, this has been an incredibly lovely conversation, super rich, and it's really got me reflecting more on just like the inner work that's done at an individual level that actually supports collective work, and how the two are very intertwined to each other. Like I'm reflecting a lot on like my therapy sessions, my somatic therapy sessions, and how much that's uh, opened me up somatically and spiritually and intellectually to be able to dig deeper into the work, and to not replicate the same harmful dynamics as much as I can, while constantly also learning about the triggers and the boundaries and like all the different ways that I replicate the system that we resist against. Yeah. And really, I think this conversation also brings back to me like the concept of mutual aid as not just this like movement resistant work, but also the individual personal relationship building, and the interpersonal dynamics between each other.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, I think it's important to hold space for what is fallow. And in the world that currently exists, it's a challenging thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we're going to put all the show notes, like in the show notes, we're going to have links to like all the links that you shared with me with the zine and the essays that you've published. And I'm wondering if you have any plugins that you want to share with listeners and anything else that you want to share with us.
Yeah, I really appreciate taking the time to include me in this project. I'm excited to continue listening to the podcast and to kind of just be in dialogue and conversation as you guys bring such like a rich dialogue about mutual aid to a collective discussion. I don't have I don't have a lot of plugins. I guess I would say I'm in a period of fallow growth.
Sowing the
Um,
fields.
yeah, if people would like to be in dialogue with me, I don't have like a super public facing online presence, but you're welcome to email me at brokenteapot@riseup.net, which just links to a previous project that I did a few years ago. And um, I just really thank you for the opportunity to have these discussions. I think I've been having feelings of insecurity about what my continued place is in movement work as a working parent, as a solo parent. And it's really rejuvenating and like hopeful to feel like there's still ways to be in dialogue and have continued engagement with work that I find to be so meaningful and purposeful.
Oh, yay. That feels really good to hear. And I mean, I feel the same. This has been one of the perks of being able to do this project has been to be able to connect to people like yourself, and expand my understanding of what it means to be engaged in movement work, and to be holding space for one another. So I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to be here and speaking with me and just engaging in this conversation deeper. This has been another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things mutual aid. The Mutual Aid Podcast is part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, a worker-owned media collective focused on elevating marginalized voices, building internationalist dialogue from below, and connecting struggles across the globe. If you like the work that we do, we invite you to go to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery and become a member of our growing community for as little as $5 a month. Alternatively, you can share our work and leave reviews, which significantly helps with gaining traction against the algorithm. Finally, if you or anyone you know would like to join the conversation here, please reach out to us. Our email will be below in the show notes. Till next time, thank you for listening, and may we meet at the battlefield for liberation.